The day has come. On day 3,139 of the war in Iraq, President Obama announced it's over. American troops will be home by the end of the year. The war began as a hunt for weapons of mass destruction which were never found. Then the U.S. found itself in the middle of a civil war, caught between two branches of Islam. On this historic day, we have reports from David Martin and Nora O'Donnell. First, David, who's at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Good evening, Scott. Fort Bragg is the home of the 82nd Airborne, which currently has 3,500 troops in Iraq. They'll all be home for the holidays because today the president pulled the plug on negotiations that could have kept some American troops in Iraq past the end of this year.
The rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over.
For better or worse, the military operation, which began with shock and awe in March of 2003 and descended into the mayhem of civil war, is really going to end. Even though both Americans and Iraqis agree there are still holes in Iraqi defenses. The U.S. had offered to keep up to 5,000 troops there to train Iraqis in air defense, intelligence, and protecting against the threat of invasion, particularly from Iran. But scarred by the abuses of Abu Ghraib prison, the killings, both accidental and deliberate, of civilians, and incidents with security contractors like the Blackwater Guards who gunned down people in a public square, Iraqi politicians refused to grant American troops immunity from prosecution under local laws. Immunity is a standard agreement wherever U.S. forces are deployed. That was the deal breaker, and it now means the 39,000 troops still in Iraq, down from a high of 170,000, will all be out by December 31st.
Today, I can say that our troops in Iraq will definitely be home for the holidays.
The Bush administration had originally agreed to the December 31st withdrawal date, but the assumption had always been that a new agreement would keep a smaller number of troops in Iraq for several more years. Now, the only troops who will remain are a couple hundred assigned to the embassy in Baghdad to administer the sale of U.S. military equipment. Getting out will probably make for good politics in both countries. The question is, will it make for good strategy?
The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria is a phenomenon so terrible and shocking it seems impossible. It controls an area the size of the United Kingdom, commits mass atrocities, and launches terror attacks abroad. But to understand ISIS, it helps to tell the story of its rise. And that story begins far away and many years before the group existed. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to defend a puppet dictator against rebels. Young men from the Middle East flock in to join the rebels. Many see it as a religious struggle, and some develop extremist views. Among them is a well-educated young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Also in Afghanistan is a semi-literate former street thug from Jordan, calls himself Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They do not get along and never will, but will create the groups we today know as Al-Qaeda and as ISIS. The Soviets withdraw in 1989, and the Arab fighters eventually go home. Bin Laden grows Al-Qaeda into a global network to continue the struggle against Islam's enemies. Zarqawi forms his own group, but it fizzles. Both men later return to Afghanistan, now ruled by the Taliban. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacks America from its base there. The U.S. invades Afghanistan. Bin Laden flees to Pakistan. Zarqawi, still obscure, flees to a remote and lawless corner of Iraq. 2 years later, the U.S. does something that will transform the Middle East and set the stage for ISIS.
My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome.
The Americans topple Saddam Hussein's secular, mostly Sunni dictatorship, and it disbands the Iraqi army. Thousands of Sunni Iraqi soldiers, angry and unemployed, join the insurgency. Jihadist groups, who are also Sunni, see this as a repeat of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and again they flood in to fight. Zarqawi is among them. Zarqawi's group eventually becomes Iraq's most ruthless. He especially attacks Shia, deliberately sparking a Sunni-Shia civil war. By 2004, Zarqawi is a jihadist superstar. Al-Qaeda, isolated and weakened, attempts to bolster its image by forming an alliance with Zarqawi's group, which becomes known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But in 2006, Iraq's Sunnis rise up against Zarqawi, and the US kills him in an airstrike. Over the next few years, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is largely defeated. The Americans withdraw in 2011 from an Iraq that finally looks stable. 2011, the Arab Spring spreads across the Middle East. In Syria, dictator Bashar al-Assad cracks down violently on protesters. They eventually fire back, leading to a civil war. Assad fears the world will intervene against him, so he releases jihadists in large numbers from Syrian prisons, tinging the rebels with extremism and making it harder for foreigners to back them. Back in Iraq, what little remains of Zarqawi's group is still allied with Al-Qaeda, but now known as the Islamic State in Iraq. It's led by a bookish religious scholar who calls himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. In 2012, Baghdadi sends a top deputy to Syria to start a new al-Qaeda branch to fight alongside the rebels, Jabhat al-Nusra. Baghdadi attacks a series of prisons in Iraq, frees former jihadists, and recruits new ones, growing stronger. In April 2013, Baghdadi announces he is taking control of all al-Qaeda allied forces in Syria and Iraq. His group expands into Syria, becoming the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. But al-Qaeda rejects Baghdadi's power grab, and in 2014 formally exiles him. The two jihadist groups, long at odds, are now at war. ISIS grows powerful in Syria, in part because Assad tolerates its rise, which he does because it divides his enemies within Syria, and because foreign powers are too focused on ISIS now to worry about Assad. By June 2014, ISIS has built an army in Syria, and it launches a military-style invasion into Iraq. The Iraqi army, weakened by corruption, folds with little fight, and many Sunnis are tired of their Shia-dominated and increasingly authoritarian government, and welcome, or at least tolerate, ISIS's arrival. Within days, ISIS controls a third of Iraq and a big part of Syria. ISIS's goal is more audacious than anything imagined by Al-Qaeda: to revive the ancient caliphate and expand it to encompass all Muslims. It earnestly believes its holy war will then bring about the apocalypse as foretold in Scripture. Thousands of Muslims, mostly from the Middle East and from Europe, flock to join the group. Some join for religious reasons, but many are just disillusioned or angry and feel that ISIS offers them answers and a purpose. But ISIS quickly overreaches. That August, it invades Kurdish territory in Iraq and Syria, sparking counterattacks from better organized Kurdish forces, launches a genocide against Iraqi Yazidis, and murders the American journalist James Foley on camera, outraging the world and provoking an American-led air campaign against it. ISIS can't withstand the onslaught and loses more than a fifth of its territory. But in response, it begins launching increasingly spectacular terror attacks abroad, in Tunisia, Kuwait, Sinai, and then Paris. And so-called lone wolves, inspired by ISIS propaganda, also launch attacks, though they're often amateurish and less effective. Eventually, ISIS will lose its state. It is simply too weak, has no allies or outside funders, and is surrounded by enemies. But ISIS will respond by reverting to what it was before as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, an insurgency and a terror group still capable of horrifying violence. And in that form, it could be around for years.
The death toll from those attacks, at least 120 people dead, by far the deadliest such attacks in France.
But ISIS is gaining strength, aren't they?
Well, I don't think they're gaining strength. What is true is that from the start, our goal has been first to contain, and we have contained them.
According to police sources, one, maybe both, were detonated by suicide bombers wearing belts packed with explosives.
Some of them were dead, some others were very badly wounded, but it was a bloodbath.
Francis Hollande says Paris attacks were committed by the Islamic State.
He said, quote, "The analogy we use around here sometimes, and I think is accurate, is if a JV team puts on Lakers uniforms, that doesn't make them Kobe Bryant." Just how badly did President Obama underestimate the threat of ISIS?